Hello everyone, is Bringonthechaos Glizzy for another What If. Beerus is an Olympian god of destruction. Beerus has been erased because of the mistake Goku, but he encountered the fathers of all angels. He is in a new world field of gods. What will happen to a former G.O.D?
The Olympian god of destruction. Chapter 26, the Titanomachy 19. On the Isle of Crete. Rhea let out a sigh, as she sat down on a conjured throne of stone below the mighty rays of Helios. The physical manifestation of the Titan god's form in a more celestial shape, as his chariot stood high above in the heavens themselves, seeming to blare down upon Gaea's soil with more radiance and heat than was usual with him. Arms resting upon the arm rests of it, the Titan goddess and former Queen of the universe, lounged back into her chair, which sat just within the entrance of the mountain cave she, and previously her children, had lived in, as she glanced up. Her eyes forced to squint at what appeared to be a magnificent orb of holy light in the sky, innumerable miles up high, and gave a small smile at the god she could barely make out the silhouette of from his station. Must be in a good mood today, that Helios. Otherwise, I can't imagine his shine would be glaring down at us this hard. Rhea let out a small chuckle as she heard her friend, Amalthea, grumble at her nephew's glow. The nude goat nymph coming into view by her side with a light huff, rubbing at one of her crusty eyes as her other hand mounted on her hip. Her expression looking none too pleased by the glimmering light of the sun, as she too glanced, or rather, partially glared up at the gleaming Titan over yonder. I'd appreciate if he could take a break from riding around in his chariot once in a while, so that I could sleep in a little longer without his rays breaching into the cave and disturbing me awake. As if you don't get enough sleep as it is. Rhea snorted with a bit of amusement, pulling her teasing gaze and smile over to her longtime friend. Sometimes I swear were it not for Helios, you would not wake at all, with how heavily you can slumber these days. I'm starting to think it wouldn't be too improbable that mother had to keep you awake during Zeus's rearing, lest you would have fallen asleep in your duties. The goat nymph looked over to her with a brief snort of her own, more amused than anything herself by the playful jab. Oh, calm down. I'm not that bad, Rhea. And besides, if memory recalls, your youngest, Zeus, was the one keeping me up more than anything else during his rearing. And I don't just mean his overly loud training that I had a hand in, either. The Titaness raised a curious brow. What do you mean? Well, the nude nymph eyed her friend with a peculiar glint in her eyes. I've not told you this before, as I didn't feel it important at the time with all that's happened, but that son of yours, especially when his body matured more, had a hard time keeping his tunic on, if you catch my meaning. Rhea's cheeks tinted slightly pink at that. Ah yes, I've heard from mother he was quite the excitable type, even before Metis arrived here. That's one way to put it. Amalthea snorted again, this time, with a mix of humor and, somewhat awe, from what Rhea could discern, as a light blush dusted the nymph's cheeks. I won't get into the details with you, but I will say this. I give all my best toward Metis, because she'll definitely have her hands full with that son of yours and keeping him tied down. I'm sure everything will be fine. The former Titan Queen replied with a calm, unworried smile. Metis is a fine, wise, young goddess with a good head on her shoulders. And as for my son, I have faith that he'll do good by her, from what I've seen. With how wild that I've witnessed his sexual appetite to be first-hand, only time will tell on that one, Rhea. The goat nymph thought to herself, beginning to admittedly feel a little hot and bothered recalling the several days before Metis had arrived, where that crafty young god, now fully grown, had snuck up on her after his training, and, well, he'd certainly made sure her nights had gone sleepless, that was for sure. Add that onto the way he'd been not too discreetly ogling Gia during his and his brother's brief visit back to the Isle alongside his older brother Poseidon, and she was fairly certain that at some point, the young god would crack. She held this opinion back from her friend though, as she didn't want to come across as rude toward Rhea and her youngest, especially when it was also possible that he behaved himself and didn't go racing off like his father, uncles and even some of his aunts to have various sexual partners. Speaking of sons, though. The goat nymph started, changing the subject as her gaze trekked over to the Hecatonchires, whose heads all appeared to be watching in near every direction possible at the minute, as they stood taller than most mountains. Gia's baby boys have certainly been a lot more pleasant than I was expecting. Pleasant in what way, exactly? Rhea quirked a brow, all the while giving her a somewhat sympathetic look, given she knew the kind of feelings her giant brothers typically evoked upon first meeting, or just meeting in general, with their presence and appearance. None of which had ever truly bothered her all that much. If anything, especially now, what with them standing watch in case Kronos attempted to attack here in retaliation for what they'd done a few days ago, in aiding her children's defense of Olympus, they had her absolute gratitude. Is it that they're more cordial than you expected? More polite? Or they're quieter? Amalthea remarked bluntly. For such gigantic size that they hold, outside of when they first appeared, and when they were hurling boulders 2 days ago at Kronos' allies, they've been remarkably quiet. Wah, the mother of the Olympians began in partial surprise, before swiftly bringing a hand up to her mouth to stifle the laughter that threatened to shoot out. Her chest jiggling slightly as a fit of giggles launched into her hand. Her eyes becoming full of mirth, as Amalthea looked back at her with a look that was all too serious, which just made it even funnier. Hey. Oh, I really should have known you'd answer back with something like that. What? It's the truth. The goat nymph huffed, puffing out her cheeks as she mounted both hands on her hips, and half glared down at the giggling titaness. As raucous as your children could be, no offense, they at the very least slept during the night in soundproofed chambers, which allowed me to have some reasonable amount of rest myself. With the Hecatonchires, however, if Lady Gia is to be believed, and I have no reason to doubt her, none of her 3 giant sons over there sleep at all. And with their size, just about anything they do, even something as simple as taking a light walk, should have my eardrums bursting. Gaze shooting back over to the trio of 100-handed giants effectively standing watch for them. When the Hecatonchires were first brought here by your eldest son and made their home here, I thought I'd never get any proper sleep again, short of finding and begging Hypnos aid in the matter. And yet, instead, I've scarcely even noticed their presence half the time, even when I'm outside of this mountain. I don't know if it's because of something they're doing, or Lady Gia, but whatever it is, my sleep isn't getting disturbed by a load of noise, and that's all that matters to me. Honestly, it's beginning to feel like I'm talking with Kelone right now, the Titan goddess remarked with another light laugh as she shook her head amusedly at her friend's explanation. Okay. I'm definitely not that bad. Amalthea snorted and rolled her eyes at the comparison. That one is so lazy, you could have Kronos himself visit and threaten her to join his side, and even with her immortal life in someone else's grasp, she'd still find whatever excuse she could to lay back in bed within her tiny little home, without a damn to be given. With a brief pause, the two then shared a light-hearted laugh at the expense of the unpresent nymph who lived dozens of miles away in Arcadia. Especially knowing that what was said was genuinely true, and that the laziest nymph of all, as even her own sisters had dubbed her, would indeed be brazen enough to do such a thing if Kronos did in fact bother to visit her. Enough about me though, the nymph said, as she calmed down, one of her hands coming to rest on the top of Rhea's throne, as she met her gaze. I've been meaning to ask. Has there been any word back yet on your eldest son's condition? All I got from when Zeus and his 2 other brothers showed up here several days ago, was that he'd somehow been put out of commission. Unfortunately, that is something I do not have an answer to. The mother of 7 shook her head with a slight frown. All I do know is that apparently, the weapon he was forged by my one-eyed brothers gave him the capability to jump into his true divine form against my little brother Hyperion, without the proper training being complete. And thus, he was rendered unconscious after the battle was over. I'm rather surprised you didn't pay a visit to Olympus when they told you about that, so you could be by his side for him when he woke up. Oh, I was going to initially. Rhea gained an all too pleased grin then. That is, until Zeus told me that wouldn't be necessary, as Hera had chosen to take on that task herself. Hera. Amalthea blinked in surprise. You mean that silly daughter of yours might have finally made a move, instead of antagonizing him the entire time? Oh, I hope so. Rhea all but chirped happily, as she clasped her hands together near her chest. And here I was thinking she'd keep letting her pride get in the way, and just continue meeting him with overbearing aggression instead of just trying to get to the point. Turns out, she just needed the right scenario to really let him know she's interested. And I can't see how he wouldn't, even with how my Beerus can be, because if Zeus is to be believed, and I have no reason to doubt him, she brought him to his room and chose to stay with him while naked. Wow. The nymph whistled. And here I was thinking, given what I've seen and been told of their training, that Demeter would have been the one to be bold enough for something like that first. If this had been before that little revenge kiss, as Hera called it, back when Beerus and Styx first brought my other brothers back from Tartarus, I would have agreed with you. After that though, I was convinced it could go either way. And it still could. The Titaness giggled, taking more pleasure in the potential goings-on of 3 of her children than she probably should have. If Hera fails to follow through now, even after a perfect setup like this, then she might as well have just dared her older sister to become even more bold in order to get what she wants before she does. Another light-hearted laugh sprung from Amalthea's lips. You sound like you're really enjoying this, I must say. Oh, I am. Her friend's reply was utterly shameless. At first, I was admittedly a little annoyed that Beerus wasn't initiating himself with either of them, and seemed more preoccupied with trying to ignore them on that front or actively avoid it, for some silly reason. But now, having seen and heard all that's happened because of his lack of action, I don't think I'd want it any other way now. And what if he has no interest in either though? Maybe his avoidance of engaging with either like that is because he might have his eyes on someone else. Rhea saw her cohort wiggle her eyebrows. Perhaps he's more interested in Hestia, given their strong bond with each other. Or maybe even Gia could be the one he secretly has his eyes on, and he's just waiting until this whole war with his father is finished before making his move. Or perhaps, Amalthea smiled a little too broadly, purposefully looking the Titaness up and down. He actually has his eyes on you. PFFT. Ha ha ha. Yeah, right, the mother of the Olympians tittered while waving her companion off. You had me going for a bit when you mentioned Hestia, as I can see the potential there, but mother and me. She scoffed playfully. He looked more annoyed than anything else whenever she teased him. And as for myself, I'm but a loving mother to him, just as I am with the rest of my children. And you're certain of that? She heard and saw her friend ask cheekily, giving a jesting look as she grinned lopsidedly down at her chuckling form. You never know, one of these days after he wakes, he could end up visiting you here for a more private bonding session. Good grief, Amalthea. The chuckling began to cease with a roll of the eyes as the Titaness looked out toward the horizon, mirth coating her visage. You really need to get your head out from between your legs. That will never happen. Suddenly, a golden light briefly burst forth from in front of Rhea, forcing her and Amalthea to briefly shut their eyes from how close it was, alongside its glare being amplified by the sun's shooting rays. When both the Titaness and the nymph were able to reopen their eyes, the first thing they caught note of was the golden particles of a successful materialization flying and dissipating away before them, around a new figure neither had been expecting. The next thing they noticed rather quickly, had both of their eyes widening. Rhea's more so, becoming like dinner plates out of utter shock as the completely nude form of her eldest son, Beerus, stood in all his glory before her. His breaths hot and almost ragged, as though trying to hold something back with great difficulty. His muscles rippling from all around his body, veins pulsating around his biceps, neck and legs as he towered over her seated form, producing a shadow over her thanks to Helios, as another shadow cast over the upper portion of his face, which was upturned to the ceiling and out of view. But between her eyes was what had Rhea most stunned and mouth agape, for covering most of the small distance of little over half a meter between them, was the young god's enormous cock. The phallic mass of vein-riddled meat standing rigid and pointed directly toward her lips, its winking glands staring her down from just 3 scant inches away, and looking like it was ready to erupt at any moment. Well, Amalthea stuttered, suddenly feeling even hotter under Helios-blasted beams, as she seemed to catch Beerus's attention, from the way his body stiffened. Fancy seeing you come back here so soon, young one. His gaze turned to her, amber eyes seemingly smoldering, looking wide and intense as they fell on her form, lips parted in a cross between a groan and a growl as she flinched. Her own eyes alternating from features she could not discern and a look beginning to make her feel certain emotions she hadn't felt since her last encounter with his youngest brother, to the raging erection throbbing near her friend's face. His stare held her for what seemed like forever, but was in reality no more than a few seconds, before it slowly moved down below him to his mother, and in that instant, at least for Amalthea in the moment, it looked like his gaze intensified twofold. Beerus. Rhea practically squeaked. His eyes forcing her to partially snap out of the initial shock of his nude appearance enough to speak, but still so taken off guard that it wasn't even funny. The Titan goddess shrinking into her throne and feeling the urge to squirm, as her face began to light up a vibrant red as she half stared up at his face, half at his protruding member invading her personal space. Her fingers digging into the edges of her stony arm rests, as anxiousness swelled within her. My dear boy, why you're awakened She trailed off, as she saw his eyes narrow and twitch, and audibly gulped, feeling the heat radiating off his body. A familiar one creeping up hers as she began to feel uncomfortable upon her throne. Surely, this wasn't really happening, right? There had to be a proper explanation for this, and one that didn't involve Amalthea's jest actually being true. There was just no way. And then Beerus slapped a hand over his face, let out an explosive sigh, and exasperatedly groaned out 2 words that encapsulated how he felt right now, and were about as poorly thought out as one could imagine, given the situation. Fuck me. No less than a second after their utterance, the goat nymph's jaw dropped, as did Rhea's once again, before the shock had her power spasm through her throne, crumbling it beneath her, and she fell backwards. Her head and shoulders impacting over the ground and smooth legs flying comically high up above her, tunic falling down almost enough to expose her peachy rear, as her eyes rolled back into her skull. Fainting right on the spot. Meanwhile, back on Olympus. Oh. Hey, you two. Poseidon was the first to greet his sisters with a wave, as they trekked out of Beerus's palace. The god quickly noticing the sullen mood of Demeter, and the more exasperated, embarrassed-looking one from Hestia, as the older sister held the younger one close. A cheeky grin settling on his features, as he made his way over to them, having a good idea as to why that was. I see fair Demeter doesn't look to be in a pleasant mood. I presume Hera wasn't forthcoming with her demands to extricate herself from our brother. Hestia looked up, her cheeks still pinkish red from what she and her sister had walked in on, as she regarded her younger brother as best she could. Actually, Poseidon, Hera wasn't there when we went in. She wasn't. Poseidon blinked, his grin dipping for a look of confusion, as he stopped just a meter or so in front of the two. Then why is Demeter? That's not important right now. Hestia said so swiftly in response, that it caught the younger god off guard. Hestia seemed to compose herself a little better afterward though, letting out a calming breath, before placing a more serene smile on her face, that only Demeter in the moment, was able to tell was semi-forced. What is that Beerus has finally woke up, little brother. He has. Poseidon's confusion over the Hera situation vanished in an instant, a broad smile coming over his face, as the news of his elder brother's awakening excited him. That's wonderful to hear. The male deity then turned towards the rest of the courtyard, where their allies were mainly milling about, laying back to relax, or in conversation with one another, and caught all of their attention, as he loudly announced what Hestia had just told him. Good news, everyone. He bellowed happily, as he splayed his muscular arms out wide. Beerus has finally awoken, it seems. Most of the crowd of allies gave an audible cheer at this, while others that weren't so much the boisterous type, simply smiled in relief and shared in the pleasant mood this news brought. Well, it certainly took him long enough, if that's the case. Zeus said teasingly, as he made his way over with Metis in tow. His pleased grin at the information, and the relief in his own electric blue eyes unmistakable, with his consort being of a similar mind and visage as she trekked alongside him. And what do the days matter so long as he's awake now, brother? Personally, I'm just glad he's back up and about. Hades quipped back, not far behind the duo with a big, wide smile of his own plastered on his lips. His words getting a nod of the head in agreement from their stronger allies, such as Styx and her children, as well as the defectors from the Titan side, in Themis, Prometheus and Epimetheus, who were also, understandably, content by the news of Beerus being awake again. You have a point there, I suppose, Hades. Ha ha. Zeus let out a jovial laugh. His mood having already been in a good place after all the sex he'd been having with Metis following the failed siege, with this reveal of Beerus's recovery only adding to it. Both brothers and Oceanid coming to a stop soon by Poseidon, Zeus was the first to take a look around, mostly behind his two sisters, before asking the question quickly coming to everyone's mind. So then, where is our dear, eldest brother, him? I don't see him around here, so I presume he's still within his palace. He then paused briefly, noting the distinct lack of another, unimaginably beautiful member of their family's presence as well. And come to think of it, what of Hera as well? She was with him last I saw, the lucky bastard. Yet she has made no appearance either, it seems. We're not sure about Hera. She was gone by the time we arrived. Hestia spoke up, bringing everyone's attention. As for Beerus, he'll be out here soon. There was just the young goddess fought down the blush that attempted to seep through her cheeks, as she gave them the vaguest answer she could. Something he needed to attend to first. Something he needed to attend to. Hades quirked a brow, and he wasn't the only one. What do you mean by that, Hestia? Metis stepped forward, a look crossed between intrigue and confusion, as her arms folded beneath her bosom. Forgive me if I sound rude, but what could he possibly have to attend to, other than coming out to us and getting informed of all that has happened? Not to mention going over what our plans will be following Cronus' failed siege against us. Well, he didn't quite say, he didn't have to. It was obvious from what she and Demeter had seen, and Hestia once again had to force down the blush attempting to surface because of the thought. I trust that whatever he had to do was important, though. Poseidon gave a humid snort, as he mounted his hands on his hips. I guess it must be. Though I must say, with the way she was cradling him when I last paid visit to Beerus's room, if you'd not already told me of Hera's absence upon getting there, I would have thought this a potential cover for whatever is about to come out of your mouth, brother. I'd advise you to keep it to yourself. Demeter piped in, her eyes narrowed like slits on her brother, with a foul-looking scowl etched over her gorgeous features. Her darkened expression alone speaking volumes of how much she disliked where he was going with that. Well now, looks like someone's feeling rather agitated. The younger deity shot back with a teasing smile, unafraid of his older sister's potential wrath, as he met her glare with an amused shrug, raising his hands up in mock surrender. No need to bite my head off, Demeter. I'm only kidding. Only kidding, he says. Epimetheus leaned over to Prometheus with a snort of his own, the latter chuckling as well. He knows damn well he wasn't the only one who would have been thinking that. Not hearing the Titan's remark, due to him and his brother being further out, Demeter simply let out a disgruntled huff at her brother's antics, turning away from him with a borderline childish pout. The goddess being let go of by Hestia, as she folded her arms below her breasts. In any case, Hestia let out a sigh, as she drew everyone's attention back to her. Our brother will be out here eventually once he's sorted out what he needs to. For the third time, she forced down a blush, as she clasped her hands down by her pelvis, and put on her gentlest smile. I kindly ask that you all be patient with him. He won't be too long, I'm sure. Hades was the first to shrug. He, like the others, finding the situation weird, but nonetheless, willing to give his elder brother the benefit of the doubt. Well, all right then. Guess all we can do is wait for him to show up. Turning to his younger brothers, the dark-haired god grinned, as he brought a fist to his other palm, and cracked his knuckles challengingly. What say you two and I have a quick spar with each other while we wait for him, brothers? It'd certainly be more productive than just standing around. I wouldn't mind that. Zeus replied with a competitive smirk of his own toward his older sibling, which was mirrored to a degree by Poseidon, who nodded in acceptance of the challenge. Of course, the silver-haired god turned his head, giving a brief surveying of the courtyard and the many inhabitants that littered throughout. We'll have to make sure any spectators of ours don't end up getting caught in the crossfire. Wouldn't look good on us accidentally harming our own allies in our friendly little skirmish after all now, would it? We'll refrain from using anything flashy then, was Hades' response, as he turned and began making his way over to a more open part of the courtyard, as some of their closer, weaker allies naturally dispersed out of respect. We'll keep it purely physical, and see which one of us perhaps is the more skilled combatant in hand-to-hand. That means no shapeshifting or dematerialization. Hey. That works just fine for me, Poseidon said with a small laugh, as he and Zeus began to follow, leaving Metis behind with Hestia and Demeter. With everyone else's attention for the time being turning to the brothers and their coming spar with each other, as they all moved back and made more space for them, Metis sighed as her gaze fixed itself back on Hestia with a flat look. All right, they're gone and nobody else is listening in. Do you mind telling me what's actually going on with him? And please don't tell me you don't know. I wasn't born yesterday, Hestia. As good as you were at masking it from your brothers, I could tell right away that there was something you weren't telling us. Ah, Hestia flipped from serene to bashful in almost an instant at being found out. Able to tell just from the look she was given alone that Metis wouldn't buy any lie. What gave it away? Your face did. Your expressions looked a bit too forced, from my view. Like you were holding back a grimace or a blush. I've seen some of my own sisters do the same before, so it's not hard for me to spot. The Oceanid raised a brow and gave the blonde goddess a side eye. That and Demeter being in a mood. Only time she looked more irritable than this was when she walked in on Hera with your brother's sleeping body snuggled up into hers, and you were forced to pull her back out before she lost it. And seeing as Hera was nowhere to be found, according to you, that leaves the remaining cause as to her irritation stemming from something to do with Beerus specifically. Demeter huffed again, sending a glare Metis' way, both for the reminder of Hera's antics, as well as being accurately called out. You really sure you want to know what he's up to? Well, yes. Of course, I do. Metis answered without hesitation. As I said before, he should be out here with us by now if he's awake, where we should be going over what's occurred with him, and what our next move should be. If we're going to win this war with Cronus Lot, we'll need to plan out our offensive. Yet instead, he's gone off to do something else post-awakening without a word to any of the rest of us as to what it is. Glancing between the two sisters, and seeing their less than stellar expressions at her words, Metis chose to sweeten the deal, so to speak. If it makes you feel more at ease, I'll promise to keep it a secret. Won't even mention it to Beerus himself when he gets back, in case he expects you two to keep it confidential. Whatever it is he's doing. She said, meeting the blonde's aggravated look in particular with a calm visage, throwing up a light, friendly smile to diffuse any potential tension. I'm just curious is all, so apologies if I'm coming across as nosy here. If both of you would still prefer not to say anything, I'll. Grabbed by her shoulder without warning, Metis was suddenly pulled closer to Demeter, who with a very displeased look, began whispering into her ear so that only she could hear what was being said. Hestia could only blush embarrassedly when Demeter pulled away, and she saw how pink the elder goddess' cheeks got, whilst her mouth fell open like a fish flailing out of water. Happy now? Demeter grumbled, before stepping back and bending down to take a seat on the lower section of the steps leading up to Beerus's palace, placing her chin and cheeks in both hands as her arms propped up near her knees. Intent to just watch her brother's little spar while waiting for Beerus's return. Hestia glanced away herself from the Oceanid, as she openly stared wide-eyed between both for what seemed like a long moment in stunned silence. When her mouth finally shut, however, her visage turned almost comically incredulous, as she slapped a hand to her face in disbelief. Oh, you've got to be fucking kidding me. Atop Mount Othries, around that time. I see that you're back up and about once more, Atlas. Kronos remarked coldly from his throne, back in full Titan size, as his general stepped through the doorway of the room that his father Uranos had once occupied with Iapetus in tow. Yes, my lord. My apologies for the wait. The Titan god of endurance and strength bowed his head in shame with a grimace, before making his way closer to the seated Titan king. The faintest flickers of electricity, still unbeknownst to him, licking off random parts of his back. There's nothing I can say to make up for the folly of me being taken out in such humiliating fashion during the siege, so I shall readily do what I must to earn back any favor lost. The mountainously muscled Titan exclaimed passionately, before slamming his fist into his hard, beefy chest for emphasis, sending out a small shockwave felt throughout the room by its other occupants. I swear it. Rather than hearing some acknowledgement from his leader, a girlish giggle filtered out then through the room instead, from a voice Atlas remembered well, despite his memory still being on the fritz. His head then whipped to the side in surprise, as a female figure that had initially gone unnoticed by him made her presence known, with her back pressed up against the walls, and hands laid flat on it by her sides. Well said, father. I expected nothing less from you, and I'm certain Lord Kronos didn't either. She said with a voice as sweet as honey, and a gaze as fond as could be, as she looked toward Atlas with her eyes, which were such a splendid shade of sea blue, that their radiance outdid even the finest of shining gems. The newly revealed female goddess stood at less than 5.5 feet tall and wore a silk, white tunic, which flowed down like a small dress toward her knees, caressing down over her slim, creamy legs and juicily thick thighs, while hugging her superbly slim waist and wide, curvaceous hips. The fabric of the silky garment jutting outward from her chest, with two small, crinkled tents formed above her round, perky C-cup breasts, highlighting her stiff nipples which pricked against the thin cloth. A window formed on the top of her dress to expose some of her pale cleavage. Her hair was a mesmerizingly gorgeous caramel blonde that looked softer than the silk she wore and as captivating as glimmering gold. It was long and somewhat wavy, reaching just down past the middle of her back, with strands of it framing her blushing, exceedingly fair cheeks and high forehead. Her inexpressibly beautiful face set into a warm smile with glossy red lips above a petite chin, and below a slim button nose, giving her a bit of a pixie-like visage, though clearly on a much higher level of attractiveness. K. Calypso. You're here already. Atlas damn near balked, taken aback by one of his own being here so soon. His gaze then shot back to Iapetus briefly, only for his father to give him an "I told you so" look, clearly having expected this to happen even sooner than Atlas himself had anticipated. Whilst you were down, Atlas, I sent Thea out to round up any remaining potential allies that could be of some use to us. I shall let you know now that every other one of your daughters chose to remain outside of this conflict, and out of respect for you as my general, I allowed them to do so without pushing further. Calypso here was the only one of your children fully willing to answer the call, and as you can see, showed up readily to lend her assistance. Kronos explained coolly, an intense calm having consumed his features and demeanor, giving no emotion away. Turning his gaze toward Iapetus specifically, Kronos garnered his older brother's full attention with his glare. And on the topic of our allies, Iapetus, I would like for you to gather them all up for me and bring them here. For getting new faces to join us is not the only development that has been made, so now that Atlas is awake, it is high time I speak to you all about our next move. Ah. Understood, brother. Iapetus nodded, giving his son a look of sympathy, knowing he'd rather not have any of his own children involved in the war, if it could be helped, before teleporting out of the room to collect the rest of their remaining allies. No sooner had this happened, did Atlas make haste, moving closer to his daughter. His much bigger frame casting a massive shadow over his kin unintentionally, as he got within less than a foot from her. His massive, calloused hands landing down firm, but gently on her far punier shoulders, as he leaned his head down, and met her eye to eye when she looked up unflinchingly with that same smile. His own face one of concern. Calypso, are you absolutely certain you want to aid us directly? You are aware of what you'll be getting yourself into, right? He asked, worry piercing through his voice, even as he attempted to keep it composed. But of course, father. I would not be here if I wasn't. She answered quick and easy, making it clear she hadn't even had to think about it. I wanted to be of more help to you than simply sitting back like the rest of my sisters and giving my passive support. So, as Lord Kronos said, I came as soon as I was asked by Thea if I'd be willing to get more involved. And as for if I'm aware of what I'm getting myself into, Thea was kind enough to let me in on all the details. Did she now? Doubt seeped through the muscle-bound Titan's tone. Even though he knew well of Thea's character, there was a part of him that felt, and perhaps he was just being unreasonably suspicious, that she may have omitted a detail or two to stop his daughter from having second thoughts. Father, the younger goddess sighed, able to tell her father didn't quite believe her. I know well about the rebels, led by Lord Kronos' children, as well as the Hecatonchias that are on their side, and just how dangerous they all truly are. Thea let me know in depth what happened during your attempted siege, and she also let me know of the horrible fate that befell Hyperion at the hands of Lord Kronos' eldest son, Beerus. Atlas took notice of the way she frowned deeply at that, looking genuinely disturbed by what she'd apparently been told, as she broke eye contact with him briefly and looked down. He chose that moment to speak again, this time more sternly to his child, as he gripped her shoulders a little harder. And even knowing all that, you're still going to put yourself in harm's way, despite the chance of you being dealt a similar fate to Hyperion, or worse. Have you really thought about what could happen to you in this conflict, should you end up at their mercy? I put some thought into it, yes. Some thought isn't good enough, Calypso. Her father cut her off gruffly, as he suddenly hoisted her off the ground by her shoulders with ease, her toes wriggling and feet dangling more than a foot above the floor, until she was at eye level with her parent. The situation is severe, and while I hate to admit it, there's a legitimate chance we could end up being defeated. He all but bellowed, staring his daughter down with the utmost seriousness. And if that happens, and you haven't already been taken out yet, I can assure you the punishment you'll get for having fought for us will be quite grievous indeed, going off how they dealt with Hyperion. As I said before, Father, I'm aware. She replied back just as seriously, turning her head back up to meet his steely stare head on. A resolution being present in her eyes that made it clear such information would not dissuade her from choosing to fight in the slightest. I know of the risks involved, especially should we be defeated, but that will not stop me from lending you all the power that I can. I may have no proper experience fighting like you do, but you and Mother didn't raise me to be a coward who simply stood by and did nothing when things get bad. I also doubt either of us taught you to be a fool who jumps into a situation without being prepared. No. But you did teach me that if I ever wanted to do something or wanted something for myself, I should do everything in my power to pursue it and ensure that I get what I desire. She shot back readily with a look of determination. And right now, I desire to support you and everyone else here at O3s as much as I'm able to, even if that means going up against someone like Beerus, who was somehow able to take Hyperion out of commission completely, and anyone else that's on his side. The Hecatonchias included, even if they're strong enough to easily crush me like they did so many others from our side already. Atlas cringed internally even at just the thought. He may have said earlier he'd rather his own children fight than his brother Menoetios, as they'd at least listen to him, but that was purely because of how aggravating his sibling could be. The reality was, he despised the notion of having any of them involved in this, knowing well now the level of threat they were facing, and how he and the others had greatly underestimated their opposition. If she went out there as she was, and tried to fight any of them, she'd be easily trounced. She was able to use her divine power well enough, as were all his children, but not a single one of them had ever been trained in combat by him, or trained to efficiently wield the divine power to its fullest potential, let alone actually getting a domain and attaining a true divine form. And why should they have? It wasn't as if any of them would have expected a war to be waged against Lord Kronos, and by proxy, himself. With how powerful they were, up until recently, the idea they could even be seriously challenged would have been preposterous. And yet here they were, stuck in a situation where they were the ones now on the back foot, after trying to be the aggressors and eliminate their enemies as fast as possible. And because of that, they were having to scrounge up whatever they could that remained of their other allies who hadn't participated in their failed siege. What an utter mess. Father, if you feel I'm ill-prepared for this, then how about giving me some actual training then, to bring me up to a better standard? The caramel blonde asked, breaking him from his own thoughts and returning his full attention to her. Train you? In the middle of a war? His eyebrows pitched dubiously. Why not? She shot back. Lord Kronos' children are much younger than I, from what I understand, so they would have had to been training all this time, even with the threat of us coming down on them, so what's wrong with me doing it too, to be more prepared for them? Her smile returned as she raised her hands up to his face, cupping his masculine cheeks affectionately within her soft palms. That way, you could be more at ease with me being out there to help fight against the rebels, and I could contribute more to the war. At first, Atlas' expression was somewhat incredulous at what he'd heard. Admittedly, he had no real counter to what she was saying, other than, I'd be more at ease if you didn't get involved like this, but he knew well that such a line would get shot down instantly. Gazing deep into her eyes again, he knew with certainty that she definitely wasn't backing down at all. After a small moment to take in what she'd said, despite himself, Atlas ducked his head as a genuine laugh kicked out of his mouth. His huge form rumbling with the sound of his laughter, as he closed his eyes and almost looked downright hysterical. Ha 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 ha. Calypso merely blinked, looking somewhat dumbfounded by her father's sudden change in demeanor. Hey, what's so funny? My word. Your mother has birthed for me quite the child. Atlas couldn't help but smile both fondly and pridefully at his progeny, inwardly trying to recall the name of said mother. It wasn't his wife Cleone. A different nymph it was. He remembered the pretty face of her, certainly, as she had been one of the many beautiful nymphs who danced and entertained him in the broader throne room throughout his years as Kronos' appointed general, all of whom he'd slept with, and had even interacted with a few times during Calypso's upbringing. He tried to remember when, or if she'd given him her name, and kept drawing a blank. All he recalled was the multiple times her blushed, moaning face was beneath him as he fornicated with her, and she screamed out his name. Knowing he couldn't stand here for long thinking about, Atlas disregarded remembering it altogether, as it wasn't really important. Instead, putting all his focus on the daughter he could never forget, right in front of him, and continued. He. Stubborn to a fault and unwilling to back down. There's no questioning you being my daughter. Blinking again at those statements, Calypso simply smiled wider at her dad's words, as she let out a light giggle. Well, as if that was ever in doubt. Indeed. Placing her back down onto the ground as her hands fell from his face, Atlas could only shake his head in a weird mixture of amusement and slight exasperation, as he looked down upon one of the many daughters he'd helped bring into this world. The Titan marveling almost at how she held a natural, feminine beauty that definitely exceeded even that of her mother, whilst holding a personality closer to his own, with how unbelievably stubborn she could be. It was enough to warm his heart, and his loins simultaneously. What a goddess. Were it not for his self-imposed rule of not laying with any he'd helped spawn, he'd have been all over her in an instant. Whoever ended up garnering her interest in the future would be one of the luckiest in the world, in his eyes. Fine. I'll allow you this, but only so long as you listen to my instructions, whenever I give them. You hear? Not a problem. She nodded enthusiastically. I'll follow your word as best I can. Hey. The muscle-bound Titan snorted. Good to hear. Your uncle Menoetios could definitely learn a thing or two from you, my dear Calypso. Oh please, as if I could ever be taught anything of use by one of your delicate daughters, brother. Atlas felt a scowl form on his lips instantly, and Calypso wasn't far behind him, as both looked behind him to see the sneering visage of Menoetios gazing back at them, with his arms folded by his chest. Flecks of gold dissipating around his brawny body, as a sign he'd only just appeared seconds prior. His uncles, aunt, and several other new faces that he recognized, though couldn't recall the names of following suit not long after, appearing close by to them even as the younger sibling continued speaking. Honestly, if she's here for what I think she is, then we really must be scraping the ass end of Gear's earthen plane for folks to battle alongside us. I'd be shocked if she even knew how to throw a punch, let alone fight. She may not know how to fight just yet, but that will be rectified soon, under my tutelage. Atlas shot back gruffly, turning his body halfway as he narrowed his eyes sharply on his brother, and gave the latter full view of Calypso, as well as himself. Unlike you, she knows how to actually listen to her betters, whereas you would be the type of idiot to ignore any and all warnings and just recklessly charge into anything and anyone put in front of you without a second thought. With how you are, you'll end up getting annihilated by the rebels for your hubris in record time, and I won't be in the least bit shocked when you do. Hey. Annihilated by the rebels. As if. The younger brother scoffed. Unlike you, Atlas, I'm not so pathetic that I'd let such a fate as the one you just suffered through happen to me. Where you failed about as miserably as you could, I shall succeed, and show you how it's done. His eyes then flicked over to Calypso, and became a bit more lecherous. And after that, I think I'll go and have some fun with little Calypso here in celebration of the rebels' defeat. He patted his crotch in an all too obvious way. Might as well give her a reward after all and show her a good time for having the courage to want to fight with us, even if she's of no worth on that front. Calypso visibly cringed. If that's my reward, I think I'd rather take a punishment. Oh. You're one of those kinds of dirty little nymphs, are you? He laughed. Well, if that's how you want it, I suppose I could find a gag and a whip for you when the time is right. You know damn well that's not what she meant, brother. Atlas cut back in, his tone and expression becoming more vexed by the second, as he put his arm out in front of her. And just so we're clear, there isn't a chance in Tartarus bowels that I will allow any advances upon her from you. Hey. As if I'd need your approval for anything, Atlas. He snorted back disrespectfully. Though I must say, it is rather amusing seeing you act protective of a nymph for once, given how you usually operate around them. Suppose your own daughters must be a small exception to your normal habits. He shrugged indifferently, further irritating his brother. Regardless, I'm not sure you're in any condition to try and stop me if I do. You were still struggling to stand after getting out of bed a short while ago. His eyes then hovered over his elder sibling's shoulder, where flickers of electricity zipped by, and laughed. You sure you won't trip over yourself like a fool if you try to get in my way? Why you? Atlas' eye twitched in agitation. The Titan's patience having officially worn thin again, as he sucked in a sharp breath. A huge vein beginning to pulsate and pop around his neck from anger as he grit his teeth and made to step forward. NNGH. His eyes widened, however, when those damned tremors from before hit him yet again, and this time he had no magically enhanced wall to grip onto. His body then tipped forward, much to the surprise of nearly everyone there, including those just appearing, as he dropped down to a knee, his hands instinctively planting themselves to the floor to steady himself before he could fall on his side, as the quakes raged through his whole body. Larger flickers of electricity zipping over his back before the eyes of all watching, with some beginning to lick by his face as he grunted at the sudden lapse of bodily function. Father. Calypso called out in worry, quickly moving to his side and kneeling while laying her hands on his shaking shoulders. Her expression a mix of deep concern and alarm at his sudden fall and shaking form. What's wrong? Damn it, my boy. I thought I told you to take it easy. Iapetus's voice sprung forth, the father of the Titan of Endurance rushing forth after only just reappearing himself. His expression mirroring Calypso's to a degree as he came to a stop and knelt down by his son's other side, grabbing and swinging one of the younger Titan's massive arms around his shoulders to act as support for him. By the heavens, your body's trembling even worse than last time. He has only himself to blame for that one, father. Allowing himself to be felled by some upstart rebels, as he has. Menoetios remarked insolently, caring nothing for his brother's plight. Fuck you, brother. Atlas hissed over in his sibling's direction, grinding his teeth down so hard they almost cracked, as with a little assistance from his father and daughter, he rose back up to his feet in spite of the continuing tremors. The mountain of a Titan looking ready to launch himself at his disrespectful bastard of a brother despite the current ailment of his form in that very moment. Something which the younger of the two seemed eager to see him try, if the goading motion he made with his hand was any indication. That is enough. Kronos bellowed, his voice distorting at the end from the amount of power he put behind it, as he summoned his scythe by his side, and slammed the butt of it on the floor. A shockwave rippling out as a result which buffeted against all those present within the room, and shook all of O3's to its very foundations, as his eyes blazed red with barely contained fury and divine power. All was silent then, as everyone turned their full attention to the King of the Universe. His glare so potent at that point, that even Menoetios, for all his arrogance, shut his mouth and lowered his hand immediately upon being under it, and seeing the way his lord's weapon glowed an ominous, deep, frightful red to coincide with his now flashing aura encompassing his seated frame. for he had not even risen from his throne yet. Save your aggressions for the battlefield, Menoitios. Atlas, he said, swinging his crimson glare between both. Your powers and animosity are best used there, against our enemies, not each other. His open hand clenched in a shaking fist of fury, as his glare somehow intensified. You're not fledglings anymore, but fully grown and matured titans. So, act like it. Kronos boomed in a cold, brutal tone that practically challenged either of them to object. Neither did, sensing the unbridled ire of their king pouring out to the surface. The older of the two bowing his head in shame for once again allowing his emotions to get the better of him, while the younger of the two looked away, unable to meet the king's crimson gaze, as spacetime warped and crackled around his seated form. A tinge of shame hitting him as well. Right then, the Titan leader started, his aura and glow dissipating as he swept his gaze across the couple dozen divine beings Iapetus had gathered before him that had answered the call sent out, along with his siblings and general who'd returned from their failed invasion. Upon making sure everyone fighting for him was accounted for, he centered his gaze once again, for the moment, on Atlas and his father. Onto more important matters, starting with what ails you, Atlas. I can already tell, even without the words that have been bandied about, that you're suffering side effects from our last battle with the rebels. Tremors, my lord. They quake my body from within, and are making it a challenge to even stand up. Atlas revealed honestly, much to his own chagrin, even knowing how bold such an admission might make his younger brother, and also how much it wounded his pride to admit that standing up on his own power was causing him trouble. It's almost like those rare earthquakes that happen because of Gaia, only instead of coming from within her earth form, they're happening from inside my own body. No way, Calypso whispered in shock, so low that only her father could really hear her. And is that all? Kronos narrowed his eyes, as he saw more of those flickers of electricity darting along his shoulders. Because I get the feeling there's more than just that. There is. Iapetus answered with a pained expression. He's been having trouble with his memories as well. Some have been completely wiped from his mind, while others, like the build-up to and our subsequent battle with the rebels, have some fuzziness to them in his own words. He couldn't even remember who he was fighting before he got taken out. His free hand balled into a fist at the thought of the one responsible for that. Taken out by your youngest son, brother. Him? Kronos looked to be in deep thought at this. All the while, nearly all of those who'd arrived and not been part of the prior siege, began looking and whispering amongst each other in concern. Beginning to question if they'd made the right choice or not in answering the call, not only knowing their side had been repelled beforehand, but also now seeing what the rebels had been able to do to the second most powerful Titan in existence. Lasting effects like this were foreign to all of them, after all, so seeing damaging effects that actually lingered, and on someone stronger than any of them, was quite jarring to say the least. Naturally, these whispers and mutterings did not go unheard by any of the elder Titans or Atlas, Calypso and Menoitios. Krios and Koios looked genuinely angered by them, though the former looked somewhat understanding at the same time, given he'd lost his son Pallas to the enemy. The elder Titan wondering to himself what had become of his son, as given Styx, vitriol, he doubted he was left buried beneath the boulder he was struck with. That'd be too kind for her, given how spiteful she showed she could be already. Was he in captivity under hers and their children's watch? Or had he been dealt with in much the same way they'd dealt with Hyperion? It was hard for him to say, and he didn't like either option. Thea, meanwhile, hung her head and made a chagrined expression of her own. her thoughts branching in two directions. The first wondering how they could even make a comeback against the rebels, what with the power the Hecatonchians boasted, alongside the surprising power and smarts of their opposing side, which combined had managed to send them packing while taking out the bulk of their army. The words and chatter of those around her only amplifying such thoughts. The second, obviously, had to do with her felled brother husband, and what she'd learned from Styx. Much as she wanted to believe Styx only said what she said to get underneath her skin, she was no fool. She could tell Styx was telling the truth, even if she did not want it to be the case. He was in their mother Gear's hands now, and was apparently left in an awful state by Beerus. And as loyal as she was to Kronos and the others, she'd be lying if she said there wasn't a part of her that didn't want to try her hand and contact her mother. Perhaps beg forgiveness from her and stop participating in the war if that's what was needed, if it meant getting to see her brother husband once again, even knowing how agonizing it'd be for her to see whatever grisly state he'd been left in. Naturally, that latter thought she'd never share with anyone here, least of all Kronos, knowing how treasonous that would come across to him at this point if she dared take the coward's way out and do that. She couldn't, of course, because Hyperion would never forgive her for doing such a thing, even if it was to be by his side. She was in this, as she'd always been, for the long haul. As for Iapetus, he mostly ignored them. The Titan more presently concerned with his son, and what Kronos would say next, as it was clear to him, knowing his younger brother as well as he did, that he had something that may turn the tides for them, else he wouldn't have bothered calling such a meeting in the first place. As for said son of his, even greater shame showed itself on Atlas' face, having allowed himself to be in this situation. To be humiliated like this, because of some upstart gods and the weapons they wielded. If only it were all just an awful dream that he could wake up from and then demand of Hypnos to never have set on him again. Calypso did her best to take Iapetus's approach, and tried to ignore what was being said as well, but found herself glancing around as she remained by her dad's side, looking over the faces of those whispering and murmuring amongst themselves. The nymph immediately seeing the unhidden worry for their chances in this war, taking her father and Lord Kronos' side like this, written all over their faces, and began to worry a little just how loyal they'd truly end up being to the cause, if this kind of doubt was already springing up. HMPH. Bunch of worthless weaklings. Menoetios thought disparagingly, glancing back with naked disdain for those expressing doubts. And here I was thinking my brother was pathetic for being felled like he was by the rebels, despite being meant to be Lord Kronos' right-hand titan, and yet here these pitiful lot are, acting like this before they've even reached the battlefield, because they see Atlas like this. What a joke. You have my gratitude for this information. Kronos finally spoke again after a moment, his voice cutting through the hushed chatter of most of the new faces, and bringing everyone's focus back to him, as they all quietened down. Most, including his siblings, expected him to look at least somewhat perturbed by this news. To their perplexement though, he did not look the least bit concerned by it. His visage actually being calmer now than it was a minute prior. As if such information was but an afterthought and nothing else. It figures their new toys would have their own unique side effects, given that what each of my sons wield were forged in a near identical manner to my scythe, thanks to the Cyclops. The universe's ruler continued, leaning back into his throne. Any trace of anger gone from his features, as his visage was now one of stone. Under normal circumstances, those new weapons of theirs, as well as the backing of the other traitorous gods, and especially the help of the Hecatonchians, would make our chances of victory in this war quite slim indeed. under normal circumstances. Koyos parroted, giving his brother a raised brow and confused look. His befuddlement shared by a great many in the room by their leader's strange wording. Forgive me, Kronos, but what do you mean by that? What I mean is that simply choosing to fight them head on through brute force, or with any sort of tactics I could think up, would never be enough to claim victory. Much as I hate to admit it, they already have us on the back foot, and that will only get worse as time goes along. Were it not for the Hecatonchias, our invasion could have been successful, but with their involvement, there is no point in charging in as we are, if our objective is to win this war, for we'd be guaranteed to be defeated every single time, no matter what we try. I very much doubt that. Menoetios thought to himself upon hearing that, offended by such a dismissal of his and the others' combined might. Seriously, guaranteed to lose no matter what they tried. All because of those stupid Hecatonchias. Surely, they didn't put up that much of an impenetrable front. All they did was chuck boulders, from what he'd heard. Each packed with an immense amount of magic power, sure, and carried a nasty little side effect with them if you got hit full on, but he was pretty confident he could think of a way or two around that, and if he could do that, surely the king. Kronos' eyes then narrowed sharply, and his next words stopped anyone from spreading further doubts, as well as pulled a significant amount of intrigue out of Iapetus's younger son. However, there is one way we can ensure our victory, no matter what, provided we can pull it off. There is. Thea looked up wide-eyed, mouth almost agape in surprise. And who could blame her, after the ass-kicking and demoralizing they'd suffered, alongside what he'd admitted previous to that? Yes, there is indeed, dear sister. He nodded with an expression none could read. And if I'm to be honest, I never thought I'd end up having to rely on it in order to achieve victory in the war waged on me by my children. Matter of fact, I myself had almost completely forgotten of its existence, given how long it's been since I last saw it, and furthermore didn't even fully believe in its usefulness to our cause. That is, of course, until one of our allies, Aegean, whom I trust the word of, reminded me of its existence and unflinchingly confirmed its efficacy to me earlier today. Its existence. Atlas furrowed his brows at the wording, the worst of his tremors having left him, as he thought upon what his liege had just said. Is he referring to an item or creature of some sort? Definitely can't be a god like us if he's describing it like that. He didn't have to wait long to get an answer on that. Our main goal, as of now, in order to guarantee we win this war, will be the successful capture of a certain creature, which calls itself the Ophiuterus. The Titan King revealed. It is a being that was born solely from my mother in the early days of the universe, not long after she bore the heavens, my bastard father, as well as the sea, my uncle Pontus. The latter of which this creature calls its home, residing in the depths of the boundless sea too deep for my divine sight to see. Bore from our mother alone in the early days and resides within Pontus. This is the first I'm hearing of such a creature, Thea thought in befuddlement, glancing around to see if any of her fellow deities knew of this Ophiuterus that Kronos was talking about, only to notice most of them looking just as out of the loop as she was. Her other brothers, however, appeared to be the exception, it seemed, for they all had pensive looks which made it clear that they recognized the name of it. She'd have to be sure to ask one of them about that later, seeing as the aforementioned Aegean, god of the storms of the sea, who clearly knew the most about it, for whatever reason, was nowhere to be found in the room. Probably already sent off to find it by her brother, if she had to bet. Something that sounded this good, if actually true, would be worth finding as soon as possible, after all. The task of finding and capturing this creature I have, of course, assigned to Aegeon himself, given that he too resides within the sea, as one of Pontus's sons, and knows the domain better than any of us do. As he said this, Kronos couldn't help but think about how he'd have loved to have given this task to Oceanus if he could, given his eldest brother ruled over it as his domain, and would thus be completely in sync with Pontus, allowing him to locate anything within his waters instantly. Now more than ever, he felt angry at his brother for wanting nothing to do with him or his other brothers, as he could have made this task pathetically easy for them, in comparison to literally anyone else, besides Pontus himself, who'd never give them the time of day. He would have tried to threaten his brother into helping if he thought it would work, but he knew well that Oceanus did not fear him, not even with his trusted scythe, and would be far more likely to fight him than give him what he wanted if he tried to force an answer out of him. And a fight with his eldest brother was not something he needed right now, especially since he either gained nothing from it, or worse, and most likely, he'd make a full-on enemy out of him, pushing him out of his neutrality directly towards his children out of spite. A scenario which would be catastrophically bad. Yeah. Best to leave him out of this. Aegeon has already begun his search at my behest, he continued, confirming Thea's thoughts as well as letting everyone else know for certain why said god wasn't in attendance. Which is why he's not joining us right now. He is fully aware of the severity of our situation, so I have no doubt he shall find the creature in as timely a manner as he can, and bring it back to us, wherein the necessary rite shall be performed to attain what we seek from it. Finally rising from his throne then, Kronos, being the only one currently in his true, titanic size, towered over his subjects as he glared down at them with authority, his voice booming down loudly upon them. In the meantime, however, whilst we wait for his return, it'd hardly be proper for us to just sit on our hands and do nothing, as that might make our enemies grow suspicious of us. Thus, we shall proceed to keep them distracted in whatever way we can. His eyes then fell toward Menoetios in particular for but a brief instant, noting his now antsy posture and expression, before looking out more broadly at all his subjects once again with an intense glare, and an almost humid rumble. And for those of you who are curious, and desiring of violence, you'll be pleased to hear that the best way for us to keep them distracted, will be to continue meeting them in battle. While this got a tooth-bearing smile from Menoetios, it garnered a deep frown from Atlas, who was not afraid to speak up on the matter. What about the Hecatonchias though, Lord Kronos? Atlas asked, standing up fully under his own power once again, as he snuffed out the last bit of those tremors racking his mountainous frame through sheer force of will. His expression one of concern, as he stepped out from between his father and daughter, and met his king's stare. Not that I doubt you, but engaging them in battle again before this Ophiotris you spoke of is captured, given what we went through the first time, could end up going very bad for us. One wrong move could see any one of us squashed by them, including you. Can we really afford to take that risk? Your concerns are valid, Atlas. One wrong move could indeed see any one of us taken out, like most of our army was during the siege. The Titan ruler acknowledged with a nod, though did not look perturbed in the slightest. Rather, he appeared confident. However, I shall not be having us go about engaging them like we did during the siege. Now that I'm fully aware of the defenses, as well as where those abominable Hecatonchias are, I can think of a fair few ways in which we can launch attacks to keep their attentions focused on us, while minimizing potential losses as much as possible. I see. The muscle-bound Titan nodded back, finding the answer to be satisfactory. Forgive my intrusion then, Lord Kronos, he said with a light bow of his head in respect. I await whatever orders you have for me. Then here's your first one. Calypso stood straighter and at attention when his eyes zoned in on her. Be sure to train your daughter to the best of your ability. There'll be a few weeks yet before we launch the first of our assaults, so I expect you to bring little Calypso here up to a reasonable level of competency in combat, seeing as she wants to fight with us. Understood, Lord Kronos. Atlas grinned lightly, as he turned to face his beautiful progeny, who smiled back, looking eager to learn. I shall give her my all. Yes, and perhaps that added time will hopefully allow you to fully recover from what my bastard sons have ailed you with. Kronos thought to himself with a feeling of annoyance. He could still feel an inkling of fear gripping his heart, as though a voice was whispering in his ear that none of what he was about to do would change the fate given to him by his father. He ignored it as best he could though, and remained defiant. So long as what he'd been told was true, and they were able to get the Ophiutrus's boon, victory would be assured, and he could put his father's blasted prophecy behind him. All the while leaving his accursed eldest son in countless pieces that he could never come back from, along with the rest of his rebellious children, and anyone who dared ally themselves with them. Tartarus would only be a mercy for them, as far as he was concerned. And he was all out of mercy to give. Unbeknownst to Kronos, however, along with every other deity in his throne room, a lone, small cloud rolled by behind his throne, seemingly carrying itself aloft without any wind, before it swiftly dissipated into nothingness. A little while later, back on Olympus. A sigh launched itself from Beerus's lips as he materialized himself, fully clothed in his tunic, right outside the entrance of his palace. A tired-looking expression front and center on his face, as he turned to look out at the courtyard, hearing what sounded like a ruckus going, amber eyes landing on his younger brothers first, as they appeared to be fighting with one another near the center. A hail of blows being exchanged in a fast-paced three-way matchup as each either dodged, blocked, or ate punishment from one or both of the other two, as the ground was littered with craters and perforations from the impacts of their bodies and blows. Their skill and proficiency in hand-to-hand combat had improved leaps and bounds from when they'd first started training, of that he was certain of watching them from here. It was still nowhere close to his own, but going from green as grass to what he'd consider adequate within such a short time space compared to how long he'd been doing it in Universe 7, it was quite commendable nonetheless. Ah. I see you finally decided to join us, Beerus. The god of destruction's attention turned to just down the stairs at that feminine voice, where he saw Metis looking up at him with her lithe arms folded beneath her bosom. Her visage mostly stony, with the beginnings of a frown etched on her pretty face, as she greeted him. It is good to see you up and about again. Wish I'd stayed asleep, to be honest. He grunted back shamelessly, running a hand up over his face and through his hair as he began moving down the stairs. The god taking notice of his sisters Hestia and Demeter right by the nymph, who'd also turned to face him. The former giving him a somewhat embarrassed, but welcoming smile, while the latter had risen off the step she'd been seated on and was glowering at him as he approached. Yes, well, I'm afraid there won't be much room for that in the foreseeable future. Metis responded flatly, as she grabbed his attention back. There's quite a bit that happened whilst you were recuperating that you'll need to be filled in on once your brothers are done with their spa, if you don't mind, and we'll also need to go over what our future plans for combating your father's forces will be. I'm all ears. The god of destruction remarked back, as he came down closer to them. His eyes wandering back to his twin sister, as she chose that moment to speak up. I presume you've handled your, Hestia paused suddenly, now looking a bit more embarrassed than before as her cheeks turned pinkish red, bringing a hand up to her face to cough into, as though she'd misspoke. Her teeth nibbling at her lower lip for a second in a shy, and unintentionally cute way, as she met his gaze whilst he approached down the steps. Pardon me, have you, sorted out what you needed to, brother? Beerus tried to hide the cringe that surfaced, as he made his way down the final step to stand right next to Demeter, and a few feet away from both Hestia and Metis. Yes, it's been dealt with. No offense, but from where I'm standing, you don't look all that pleased, despite handling what you needed to, Beerus. Demeter was quick to point out, tilting her head with narrowed eyes while pouting at him. In fact, you look more put off than anything, dear brother. Let's just say things didn't go exactly as well as I thought they would, and leave it at that. He replied vaguely, feeling the need to pinch his eyes at the memory of what had just happened before his return. Honestly, why did his luck have to be so shit these days? He should have put a bit more focus into teleporting into his old room, rather than the entrance of that cave where Rhea and that goat nymph just had to be waiting. If he'd only practiced a slight bit of caution there, he could have avoided the hassle he'd had to go through for wanting to relieve himself. His little flashing of her, along with his admittedly poor choice of wording after realizing he'd teleported in front of her naked and erect, had ended up giving his mother of this world the mistaken, though in hindsight understandable, impression that he'd showed up to fuck her. Having her faint shortly after his arrival and unintentionally pointing his cock right at her face was bad enough as it was. Made all the more awkward by the shocked nymph muttering how she couldn't believe she called it, when it came to Rhea catching his eye, and having the audacity to shamelessly ogle him with an open mouth before asking if he was planning to bring Rhea to his bedroom or just do it where they were. He had promptly ignored the nymph at that point, trying not to pay any mind to the way she ogled him as he slipped past his unconscious mother and walked further inside the cave, telling her not to disturb him, or there'd be trouble if she did. At some point then, this universe must have decided it wanted to screw with him some more. As once he'd made his way into the deepest, darkest bowels of the cave down by the ground floor, and begun to relieve himself, Rhea had snapped back awake and been even more misinformed by that nymph, who'd completely misread the situation. Somehow getting it in her head he'd gotten annoyed at his mother for fainting on him when he'd come for her, and had chosen to masturbate instead of laying with her because of it. Naturally, of course, being told that had his mother beside herself enough to teleport down to where he was to apologize for upsetting him, remarking on how Amalthea had let her know, before telling him she'd had no idea he'd felt that way about her this whole time. And of course, because that kind of scenario wasn't cursed already, he'd been so surprised by her arrival just a few feet in front of him, that as his balls inevitably clenched from all the wanking he'd done to his dick, he hadn't even been able to think about moving away, before he'd started ejaculating. He could vividly recall the widening of her eyes in that moment especially, before she'd let out a startled cry as she got blasted with a good half of his gooey deluge. Her body involuntarily stepping back, arms uselessly flying up and flailing a bit in the air, as her chest, midriff, forearms and legs got showered by a load far more enormous than it had any right to be. The spray hitting her violently enough to splash back and away from her, leading to the other half splattering on its originally intended target of the ground all around her feet. He didn't know what was worse. The fact he'd ended up dousing her as much as he did the ground with his seed, splashing her surprised, yelping face and torso with a heavy dosage of jizz, or the fact that a part of him found the act of doing it on her, even accidentally, and seeing how she reacted to getting covered, highly enjoyable. Embarrassment had come in droves for him by the time he'd dispensed the last rope, but remorse had not. And even though he knew why, it still didn't stop that from being possibly the most awkward moment of his life, reborn or otherwise. Made all the more abysmal by her reaction after the fact, being stunned, shaking and staring at her cum-washed front, then to his half-erect member in not horror, but a sense of awe and disbelief. Feeling rather self-conscious at that point, with the arousal mostly gone, he'd stuck his hand out and waved it like an idiot whilst his face had been set into a grimace, and had hurriedly told her he could explain this. All that had gotten him was her very unmotherly-looking gaze, as she blushed hard and told him there was no need, before looking apologetic of all things, as she then said she was sorry that she hadn't figured out his attraction for her sooner. Sensing this was going somewhere he did not want it going. No matter how much that other part of him protested, he'd ended up spending the better part of what felt like an eternity trying to convince her she had it all wrong, and that this wasn't what she thought it was, to the point of mental exhaustion. All whilst she, thoroughly convinced at that point that he was ferociously attracted to her, kept dismissing him every attempt while telling him it was okay, and that he need not be embarrassed about loving her that way. But then, just as he was starting to think there'd be no avoiding the raunchy place this seemed to be going, unless he got out of there quick, she'd thrown him a curveball. Apologizing to him one final time as she'd made all the cum on her person disappear in an instant with a quick flash of her power, and told him that, while she respected his feelings, she would unfortunately have to decline his advances. For she held no desire to be intimately involved with anyone in that manner after what his father had done to her and them, and that she hoped he'd understand, and wouldn't be mad at her and try to take her anyway. Even though she'd still had him all wrong, Beerus, at that point, seeing a way out of this absurd situation, gave up on trying to convince her that he hadn't come there lusting after her, knowing she wouldn't believe him. Instead, choosing to just roll with it to save what little of his sanity was still around, he wearily told her, quite earnestly, that she needn't worry, as he did understand and wouldn't do that to her. Rhea had then given him a grateful look, thanking him for that, before laying what was meant to be a comforting hand on his shoulder, and giving a somewhat rueful smile, before suggesting he turn his attentions to either of his sisters. As while he couldn't have her, they were easily as good as she was, and that Hera and Demeter specifically had made their own interest in him quite clear, so what harm would there be in giving either one a chance? Rather than respond to that, he'd simply hung his head with a groan, idly taking note of and presuming she must have rid the ground of his sperm as well, before he vanished without another word, ending up right back here. First the predicament with Hera, and now he'd just essentially made his mother believe the false notion he'd had the hots for her, only to get rejected in the end. This was definitely not how he thought he'd spend the day he awoke from slumber, thus far. Not by a long shot. I see. Beerus was broken out of his thoughts when he felt Demeter's dainty hand touch down and squeeze lightly on his shoulder, whilst leaning into him and squishing the side of one of her tits into his arm, giving him a look of disappointment as she did. Perhaps going off on your own to deal with it wasn't the right call in the end, dear brother. His sister's subtlety might as well have been on par with an exploding planet at this point. About the only way she could have made her disgruntlement and feelings more obvious at this stage, was if she wore a gaudy neon sign that spelt it out in flashing colors. Before he could respond to this, however. What's going on with the clouds? Hades remarked loud enough for him to hear, bringing Beerus's attention briefly over to him, as he appeared to have caught both Zeus and Poseidon in a headlock. But rather than be focused on him, his head was now upturned, looking up toward the infinite sky in befuddlement. It was then that Beerus, along with everyone else it seemed, took notice of the light bearing down into Olympus rapidly dimming from all sides, as multiple clouds that had appeared out of nowhere all around the protective, magical dome swirled unnaturally and fused together within moments. The now singular, more massive cloud blotting them out completely from any source of light, other than what their barrier was capable of emitting on its own. Beerus's mental fatigue dissipated in an instant, and any previous thoughts of his were wiped, as his instincts screamed out that something was off. Very off. The feeling that he was being watched from above struck his senses like an anvil crashing down into watery depths only seconds later, and he subconsciously found himself following Hades' lead and looking up. And when he did, it was to find the face of a bearded man formed through the cloud itself staring back down at him through the dome with a sinister smile. And cut.
Thanks for watching. Please subscribe and like this video if you want some more what if video. Comment 3 hearts for more what if.